This time on Poll Hub, impeachment for the second time for Donald Trump. This time, will the result be any different? There's numbers from a number of polls that we're looking at to see what the American public thinks. But what does it matter if you're impeached but not convicted? We'll talk to an expert on impeachments to find out what it means to be impeached but not convicted for the second time when you're president of the United States. Lots to talk about, so let's get to it. And welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Mary Griffith, Media Director at the Marist Poll, sitting in for Lee Maringoff and Barbara Carvalho today.
And they will be back next week. We're talking about impeachment because this week the House sent over the articles of impeachment, having impeached Donald Trump for a second time. No president has ever been impeached twice. Very few presidents have been impeached. But it's only half the story. You're impeached in the House, but you need to be convicted in the Senate. And then there's the possibility beyond that of not only being removed from office, which he couldn't be because he's not in office anymore, but there's also the possibility then of not being allowed to ever hold office again, kind of the ultimate, punishment. And that's something that's being considered. But Mary, I want to talk about the numbers here first. There's been a lot of polls. We've had a poll out, Monmouth's been out, CNN, Quinnipiac, and there's not like this huge universal groundswell of support for the idea of impeachment.
There's not. And let's just take a look at the Monmouth University poll that you mentioned, which was released earlier this week. A majority, 56% of Americans approve of the House the House impeaching Trump for incitement of insurrection. And when you look at the Quinnipiac poll that was released just a little bit before that, a majority, nearly 6 in 10, 59% of voters say that Trump should not be allowed to hold office again. And that's just one statistic. And looking at our numbers, nearly half of Americans say Congress should continue to take action against Trump for the insurrection after he leaves office. So while there is support for this action that Congress is taking, it's not overwhelming. It's not like it's a significant majority of Americans or voters who feel that this should be taking place at this time.
Yeah, I think that's part of the problem, I guess, if you're Democrats, or part of the good thing if you're Republicans. Whatever. There's Republicans who think he should be impeached as well, and there's probably some Democrats maybe who think he doesn't. I think that's part of it, though, is that as much as we think about impeachment maybe being a legal thing, it's less of a legal thing and more of a political thing. And politics is, of course, all about public opinion. And I would just be curious if 80% of Americans were in favor of this, would that be different? These numbers are really, really similar to Trump's disapproval rating throughout his entire term. These mid-50s in support of something happening to him, they're almost identical to the mid-50s disapproval that he was at throughout his entire term. So it seems to line up politically with where we've been for the last 4 years.
And it's really not surprising because it reflects the divisiveness of the nation that we've experienced throughout the Trump presidency, even before that. And, even in the days leading up to the insurrection at the Capitol. But it really is a good thing that we don't have to take on this topic alone today.
So let's bring in Frank Bowman, who is the Floyd R. Gibson, Missouri Endowed Professor of Law at the University of Missouri, big title, and the author of High Crimes and Misdemeanors, A History of Impeachment for the Age of Trump. This is the reason we have you on, sir, because we're talking about impeachment. Welcome.
Happy to be here.
So when we talk about impeachment, I think until Donald Trump came along, we thought about Bill Clinton, or we thought about the possibility of Richard Nixon being impeached. We thought about maybe Andrew Johnson. But this has become more of a regular thing. And I'm curious what your take on looking at all this is. Is this kind of the new normal? Is this what we're beginning to see? Or is this an exceptional past president who is seeing exceptional history being made on impeachment matters?
Well, the first thing to be recognized here is that Donald Trump was not impeached twice by accident. He was impeached twice because he was a uniquely horrible president. He was a president who, practically from the beginning and certainly climaxing at the end, repeatedly challenged American governmental and constitutional norms, and at the end, quite literally tried to overthrow American democracy by trying through various means to secure the reversal of the results of an entirely appropriate, fairly conducted presidential election. And of course, a year ago, he was impeached the first time for attempting to leverage the powers of the United States to extort an ally not coincidentally, in order to disadvantage the candidacy of the very guy who has now replaced him. These two things are not disconnected. This is a man who has persistently misused the powers of the presidency to maintain his own authority, and he just obviously did not care about any of the laws or norms that customarily govern American chief executives. So the fact that he's impeached twice is not, I think, in itself so much a testament to any particular change in impeachment or the American political culture as it is a testament to him. Now, that being said, the fact that such a person could be elected in the first instance, and having been elected, could have persisted in his assaults on American constitutionalism for 4 years with almost no pushback at all from his own political party, that's an underlying problem. And that is of which he is a symptom and not a cause. And that kind of extraordinary division between the two parties and in their understandings of what the American project is about may very well produce increasing cycles of sort of retributive tit for tat, not just in the form of impeachment, but perhaps in other forms as well.
Frank, when we look at the article impeachment against former President Trump, he's charged with inciting the insurrection at the Capitol. Is that the strongest case against the president or the former president, or was there something more to it that perhaps the House could have brought up and charged Trump with?
Well, I mean, back when the articles were being considered, I mean, I recommended, for what it's worth, which is not much, to anybody who would listen, that it might have been more prudent to have either broadened the single article that they brought forward, or perhaps bring forward a second article, which would have focused less on the events of January the 6th and more broadly on the events that began with the election and ended on January the 6th, climaxed on January the 6th. Because, and of course, if you look at the article itself, the charging paragraph, as ex-prosecutors would call it, does talk about inciting insurrection, and that's going to be the focus necessarily. But if you look at the rest of it, it does say that this event on the 6th was merely a part of a larger pattern of assault on the integrity of the election. And that, of course, is, to my mind, the real essence of the offense. Indeed, in my view, he'd certainly been committing impeachable conduct practically from the first week after the election. He quite consciously, quite persistently, without let up or any apparent check or remorse, did a whole bunch of things, the objective of which was to overturn the results of a fair election. Now, I don't think that you need to actually incite a mob to go down to Capitol Hill to try to achieve that end when nothing else works, for us to be able to say, this is a person who has essentially assaulting the central pillar of democratic republicanism. That is to say, the right of the people to choose their leaders. And he did that in so many different ways. I mean, he promoted from the beginning a falsehood, and it was a falsehood, it was another lie, that there was any material difficulty with any polling in any state. He tried to pressure state officials to change what they knew to be the truth in a variety of ways, including, as we know, the call to the Secretary of State of Georgia. He apparently, we now find, was at least contemplating a plan whereby the acting attorney general would be thrown out. Somebody else would be put in his place, and that person could at least try to pressure the folks in Georgia to overturn the results down there. And then he invited thousands of people to come to the Capitol, and while they were on the way, he tried to pressure his vice president to do something the vice president has no constitutional power to do, which is to overturn the results of election. And then when the mob gets there, he sends them down the road. Now, in the end, does it really matter whether, I mean, from a constitutional perspective, whether they broke into the Capitol or not? I think not. Why did he send them down there? He sent them down there to try to induce the Congress of the United States to do something that it has no constitutional power to do, which take the results of a constitutionally and fairly conducted election, change it, and give it to him. All of that is vastly impeachable.
For the sake of argument, though, all of that is, if you might be able to prove in a court of law, but the impeachment, the trial part, is not a court of law. It's a court of politics as much as it's about the law, and the jurors are very, very political, the most political people probably in America. So I'm always curious when we talk about impeachment, and there have been fairly few of them, but no convictions. And so is that a reflection of the fact that no matter how strong the case is, if you as an attorney were to go before a judge and a jury, you could get a conviction? How hard it is to get a conviction when the jury is senators, many of which are going to be of the party of the person who's being impeached. I mean, it seems like this being a political situation as opposed to a legal one makes all those arguments very good, but a little less relevant somehow in terms of the outcome.
Oh, true enough. But let's recognize that the impeachment process was never designed to be legal. We tend to think of it as being legal. We talk about the trial and this, that, and the other thing. We talk about analogies to the impeachment in the House as being an indictment and the trial in the Senate being like a criminal trial. But that's always been to some extent misleading. Essentially, it is a political judgment dressed up in the trappings of the law, and by design, because what it's there for is it is an inheritance from our British forebears. It's an inheritance from Parliament, who invented impeachment primarily, though not exclusively, as a device by which the legislature could strike back against the excesses of the executive. They're the crown. We inherited that, and the framers put it in our Constitution for precisely that reason. When they talked about impeachment, although impeachment is applicable to other officials, they were thinking about the president. That's all they talked about. President, president, president. They were concerned that a president might become corrupt, that a president might become autocratic. They were concerned with a president of a type they would have called a demagogue. And they wanted there to be an opportunity for the political branches of the government, notably Congress, to step in if such a person became president and to remove him. That's a political judgment in the large sense. What does disable impeachment as a practical remedy is one simple thing. They decided they needed a 2/3 vote in the Senate, which one can understand, certainly for something as grave as this. And if you don't want, as the framers did not, impeachment to simply transform American government into something like what modern parliamentary government is, which is where a simple majority of the ruling house of the ruling party in the legislature can simply throw out the chief executive, overturn the government. If you don't want that, then it makes sense that you would want a supermajority, and that's why they put it in there. What I think they failed to predict was the degree to which the party system would come to dominate American politics, the degree to which it would be a two-party system, and the degree to which people's alignment, that is to say, Congress's alignment, congressmen and senators' alignment in those parties, would come to overreach everything else. And that's been, the Johnson case is a little different. The party alignment there was so overwhelmingly in favor of people who basically opposed him that the fact that he escaped has to do with a lot of other things other than party alignment. Lots of different things were going on there, all sorts of currents and undercurrents. But in the 20th and 21st century impeachments, what you've mostly been dealing with, certainly with Clinton and to some extent, and also mostly with Trump, is this party problem. The party problem combined with the supermajority requirement.
Frank, I'd like to take a step back for a second. There's been a lot of debate, not just between the political parties, but among legal scholars about the constitutionality of impeaching a president after he's left office. Is this impeachment constitutional?
Sure it is. There are arguments on the other side. I'm not going to say it's the contrary argument's ridiculous or completely untenable. For example, on the first impeachment, you got Alan Dershowitz standing up in the well of the Senate claiming that you can't impeach somebody unless they've committed an indictable offense, which is just rubbish. The balance of opinion on that was everybody on the planet to one. But this is different. Okay, there are serious people who hold this view that somehow or other jurisdiction is lost once the office holder leaves office. I don't agree. I don't think it makes any particular sense textually. I think there's certainly ample precedent for the idea that trials can be held after someone has left office. And more importantly, I don't think these arguments make any sense in terms of sort of the original understanding of the Constitution and the structure of the Constitution, and particularly the structure of the impeachment clauses. The framers were concerned about an out of control president, and they were particularly concerned about somebody that, as I said, that they characterized as a demagogue. They then sort of came to that view due to the fact that they were all classically educated. That is to say, they grew up learning about Roman and Greek history, and they'd also, particularly Madison, had made very careful studies of prior republics before their invention of the American one, and they discovered that, at least their conclusion was, that one of the biggest dangers to republics was the demagogue. That is to say, a person who rose to power and then perpetuated himself in power by appealing directly to the masses, to their prejudices, to their hatreds, to their fears, and in that way rose to power, sustained himself in power, and ultimately transformed himself into a dictator or a king. And it is, in large measure, because of their fear of that kind of person, I think. And also, well, I think that's a good place to start, that they included two remedies in the Constitution for impeachment. One, of course, is removal, because they wanted to make sure that they could get a bad president, a demagogic president, out of the office if he or she were to get there. But they also recognized that the particular source of power of someone like that is not merely presence in office, but it's this ability to appeal past and through and over the organs of government directly to the masses, directly to the mob. And they would have probably used that word. They did all the time. And the appeals to the mob to elevate the demagogue to power and to keep them there. And it's for that reason that, among many others, but I think particularly with that one, that they included the disqualification remedy along with removal, because they recognized that this figure that they feared so much could not be entirely defanged merely by getting him out of office, because he would retain the original source of his power, very likely, his ability to appeal to the masses, and thus his ability perhaps potentially to return to power, even though they just chucked him out. I think it's quite absurd to suggest that the framers would have seriously contemplated for a moment the notion that if the culminating outrages of a demagogue determined to overturn democracy happened to occur in the final weeks before his term was going to expire, that we were all just helpless, that we just had to shrug our shoulders and say, oh, what the heck? Nonsense. I mean, to use the famous phrase, I think they understood, and certainly hope, that the Constitution is not a suicide pact, that they gave certain powers to their successors, to those who would use the document and the framework to protect the constitutional order. Donald Trump was the guy they were afraid of. He's the living embodiment of what the framers were worried about in the summer of 1787.
And indeed, that's one of the things that is being discussed, though, is this second, the second sort of Damocles, if you will, which is to keep him from ever running again. But right now, the evidence suggests that there will not be enough Republican votes to convict. I wonder, briefly before we go, if you could tell us a little bit about what you think about the value of impeachment minus a conviction is, at least in terms of the way the framers thought about it in what you've just talked about, this way of trying to handle demagogues.
I think the framers would be deeply disappointed in us. I think they would be deeply saddened by the divisions that we are now experiencing. I think they'd be maybe not wholly surprised, because they were realists, that that the American sort of political classes could sink as low as they have. I think one of the reasons that they felt relatively confident in putting up the 2/3 majority requirement was the notion that if somebody really awful were to emerge, somebody really posed a serious danger to the democracy, that certainly you'd be able to summon 2/3 of the Senate to chuck him out and to make sure he didn't come back. What they didn't anticipate was, I think, the degeneration of the American political class. to the point where they're plainly willing to ignore the most obvious sins and the greatest dangers that we've ever really seen to the republic since the period before the Civil War. Frankly, I think one of the reasons that Republicans, other than a few who seem to have retained some principles, who are unwilling to vote in favor of impeachment or conviction in this case, is because the reason Donald Trump is where he is today, the reason he's being impeached, is because he promoted the big lie that the election was stolen and tried to keep himself in office. And the problem is, of course, that most of the Republicans who are now, primly tut-tutting about constitutional interpretation are themselves nearly as guilty as he, because they either actively promoted the big lie themselves or they remain silent. And they're complicit, almost all of them. And in order for them to vote to chuck this guy out of American political life, I think would require a degree of self-examination, of self-reflection that maybe they're not capable of. And that's a tragedy for all of us.
From a procedural standpoint, while the Constitution sets forth parameters for an impeachment trial, on a very base level, not all impeachment trials are equal. So as we look to follow the trial of Donald Trump, what differences might there be, or what can we expect in sort of carrying out the trial when we look at this trial versus his first impeachment trial?
I don't think we know yet, because big questions like whether or not they're going to be witnesses are as yet undecided. How the managers will frame this, even though they've got this charging paragraph, incitement of insurrection, that they're going to have to stick to some degree. Are they going to try to frame it more broadly? Are they going to try to bring in, evidence that the public hasn't yet seen, or that is now being brought forward? I don't think we know. Now, that having been said, I do think this trial is going to be very short, because now that it seems to be clear, based on the procedural vote yesterday, that not enough Republicans are going to gird up their loins and screw their courage to the sticking place to actually do their constitutional duty. We all know what the result's going to be here. We always kind of suspected it, but there was a moment perhaps when one could have hoped. And now that we know what the result is going to be, I think the value of this exercise is primarily symbolic. It's primarily in the condemnation and the disgrace that inevitably results from a president being impeached twice. But the truth of the matter is, neither party, I think, now has a strong interest in prolonging this very long. Democrats now know, if they didn't already suspect, that they aren't going to get a conviction, and therefore there's no particular point in dragging this thing out for weeks and weeks and weeks, because they're not going to convince very many people, if anyone. The Republicans, for their part, I think, are not going to be, despite Lindsey Graham blithering about, oh, well, if the Democrats want to do this, we're going to hold on for this for months. I don't think so. I don't think they have the slightest interest in standing up day after day, or for example, because they have to do this 6 days a week under the Senate rules. Do the Senate Republicans have any interest at all? It's for sitting 6 days a week defending the outrages of Donald Trump for months. No, of course not. Everybody wants this thing now to be over in a reasonably expeditious time frame. So a week, 2 weeks, there could be lots of surprises with Trump. There often are. But absent some real surprise, a week, 2 weeks, this thing's done.
Well, we will see. The trial is set to begin on February 9th, and whether they call witnesses or not, every juror was a witness. So, they've got that at least handled already. So we'll see how it goes. Frank Bowman from the University of Missouri, professor of law there, and he's the author of High Crimes and Misdemeanors, A History of Impeachment for the Age of Trump, which is exactly where we are right now. Thank you so much for joining us and for your insights into this really great way of framing, I think, what we're going to see, this historic trial that begins again on February 9th, so a couple weeks from now. Thanks again.
My pleasure.
All right, well, that will do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. I'm Mary Griffith, and Poll Hub's executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor. Amelia Morel and Leo Ruiz are our production assistants. Hat tip to Amelia for helping us book Mr. Bowman today. Marcella Bettman is our trusted editor. And thanks to the Roper Center Archive at Cornell University for providing us with the ability to look back at survey questions and results over the decades.
And if you have questions or comments, reach out to us. The best way is always on social media. We're there all the time. We're at Marist Poll on Twitter. Same thing on Facebook and Instagram. You shoot your questions over there or something you'd like to know, and we will get back to you. Finally, if you like what you hear on Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review on whatever app that you're listening to this podcast on. Positive reviews, because of the algorithms in these things, they help other people find us. So if you think this is valuable, to you, other people might as well. So leave a review. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe. That way, this will pop into your inbox as soon as the next week's is ready. In the meantime, stay safe. Have a great week. And we will see you back here next time.